Hello, my name is Mara Hernandez, and my presentation is on redesigning care in medicine by going beyond cure with language for medical professionals and health students. Before we start, as health students or medical professionals, we always hear the word patient. But who is a patient? Well, according to Cambridge Dictionary, a patient is a person who is receiving medical care or who is cared for by a particular doctor or dentist when necessary. This is when we start to hear the word cure. Cure, 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 cure. So, according to the Cleveland Clinic, a cure is a remedy. Being cured for a disease means it's gone and it won't come back. This means that a treatment provided, which may come in the forms of, let's say, medicine, surgery, or any other form of aid, were 100% successful in eliminating disease. Okay, that does not sound too bad, as that's a goal of medicine, correct? We all want to get people fully healed. And the answer is yes to both questions. We do want people to get fully better. However, medicine has shifted toward the medical model, which is essentially a framework where illness or disability might be seen as a so called issue or problem that requires treatment or cure through medical interventions. The goal is to reach, let's say, a state of normalcy, an average, or even a statistic, as Davis put it in his book Constructing Normalcy. However, due to this plain and simple medicine and patient filter, it desensitizes many health professionals away from the patient's feelings, often treating patients as a case to cure. This may be followed by charged language or lack of empathy. So, are we as health students or medical professionals forgetting how to properly care for patients? And can emotions be part of this cure, not just medical interventions? One of these forms of charged languages I was talking about are metaphors. And honestly, it's not just medical professionals who use this, but everyone in their daily lives. But literature highlights how this could be an issue, such as Susan Sontag. She talks about how usually to describe medical conditions, people tend to use metaphors. And honestly, before this, I'll do the same as well. For example, saying she is battling cancer. Susan adds on to this by saying that many might say cancer is a demonic pregnancy, or saying, oh, the cancer victim, or even describing treatments as invasive. For example, the common example we tend to hear is invasive cancer treatment. Similarly, this is done with other conditions, as explained by Zoe Gross in Loud Hands, as she describes how often many will say fighting against autism or parents having their child stolen away from them just because they have autism. These books emphasize how metaphors intensify the condition, almost as if the condition is the main part and the person is just tagging along with it. They opt for change in language revolving illnesses, which I entirely believe should be done as well, which I'll get to in a bit about how this language causes more harm than we think. This is all to say that metaphors add emotional distress to a patient, as it could intensify emotions of fear and anger. It also makes the disease part of their whole personality, or a large part of them, which could be dehumanizing as the focus is shifted on the disease instead of the person. Again, tying back to how medicine is filtered through this medical gaze. By describing cancer or autism as a battle, it essentially makes it appear that the patient has a burden to fight on their own, which shouldn't be the case. And I want us to take a step back and put ourselves in the patient's shoes. Let's say we are the patient. You walk into a clinic and you receive the worst news. How do you feel? Being diagnosed isn't just hearing a medical term, it can change the way, let's say, you feel, how you see yourself, or how others see you, or how you imagine your future, even before the treatment begins. So imagine yourself sitting in a doctor's office and being told that you have this new diagnosis. And then, according to review of 146 studies, 72% found that the patients experienced negative psychological effects, and this could come in the forms of, let's say, fear, anxiety, or confusion, or even grief. And at the same time, 61% of the studies also reported people having positive emotions as they felt validated after hearing what they had. So the diagnosis is, as we can see, it's very emotionally conflicting, as it could bring comfort but at the same time stress. And overall, about 32% of individuals have fear of being judged or facing social stigmas due to the condition they have. So overall, we're just seeing that diagnosis isn't just a medical label. It can shape how a patient thinks, behaves, and sees themselves in the future. So we already see that the patient faces a flood of emotions from their diagnoses. So now think about how it might feel to hear things such as the battle metaphors or having to get invasive treatment or any dehumanizing words or phrases mentioned by both Sontag and Zoe Gross. Given this charged language through metaphors, there was a study conducted where researchers found that language is tied to stress biologically, not just emotionally. When under stress, people release higher cortisol levels, which in turn also affects their language complexity by decreasing it. And this essentially means that under stress, they use simple terms and may have trouble processing information and different perspectives. Now let's think back to our scenario. We have a patient, or we have you receiving a diagnosis, but then you're also hearing terms or aggressive metaphors like you have to battle cancer, which is charged language that may increase stress, making it more difficult to process emotions down to the way that you might speak. On the flip side, this study also showed that there's also positive emotions when someone had positive emotions, it was linked to greater language complexity. This suggests that using careful language may sound nicer, but it actually does help patients as well in order for them to clearly think and cope better with their diagnoses. Overall, when patients receive a diagnosis, it's best to stay away from metaphors as they may affect processing and language, such as the ones mentioned by Sontag and Gross, and they were correct to say that metaphors of language can negatively affect someone. Another issue faced is enforcing normalcy through medical interventions. This has to do with how language or the way that we say things may be perceived negatively toward patients. In other words, physicians and doctors speak at patients, not with them. This was emphasized in literature through the Cancer Journal by Audre Lorde, where she talks about her experience with breast cancer, getting a mastectomy, and being an African American queer individual. Through her story, we can take away that it is harmful for patients to stay silent. To add language and what health professionals say may add to the silencing or belittlement feeling. For example, medical language reinforces normalcy, which she experiences when a nurse suggested that she should wear prosthetics, saying things such as, "You're not wearing your prostheses," or that it's better to have them on than nothing, and that she'll feel so much better with it on. This may bring up feelings of judgment or resentment toward health professionals, taking away from the proper patient care. Overall, it connects back to Davis's claim on normalcy and the medical model and ties it back to how oftentimes medicine tries to bring people to the state of normalcy by enforcing medicines or interventions such as breast prosthetics that some people may not want to use. It is best not to just use medicine as a treatment, but also consider the words that we use to avoid any judgment or making patients feel belittled. And similar to the judgment that Lorde had felt, this actually is not the first time that people have reported feeling judged or felt that offensive language was used against them. And there's a study on how words matter, where they found that 1 in 10 patients report feeling judged or offended by medical professionals. And this reaction was even more common in patients that had poor health or that were unable to work, and I believe it was about 20% of these patients that reported feeling harmed. Patients were most hurt by 3 types of languages, which came from labels, disrespectful phrasing, and surprising or inaccurate information that they seen on medical papers. For example, they saw things written such as obese, elderly, or other things such as the patient denies, which often made these patients feel blamed and sometimes even misunderstood. Overall, the study just shows that that medical language, even though let's say it's more neutral, can actually damage trust and make patients feel silenced by their providers or even judged, as mentioned before. And it proves that words alone can cause harm even though they weren't meant with malicious intent. And a review that was done found that not only is it causing a feeling of judgment or anxiety, but also wanted to emphasize that language does so much more based off of these feelings it enhances. Research shows that chronic negative emotions like anxiety and distress activate the brain's threat system, especially the amygdala, which I highlighted in this little region. Then the hypothalamus, which is responsible for stress response, and the overall HPA system, or HPA axis, which is the stress response pathway. When the system stays turned on, the body remains in a prolonged fight or flight state, and over time, this may lead to immune system overactivation and higher levels of inflammation. And this was measured through different markers such as or inflammatory markers such as C-reactive proteins, pro-inflammatory cytokines, and also leptin, which was found higher in obese and cancer survivors. They also found differences. Essentially, these words and emotions matter as these negative emotions can actually keep inflammation elevated. This shows that emotional distress isn't just psychological, but it also has actual biological effects, which explains why physicians' words can matter so much. Overall, this relates back to Audre Lorde and the idea of how medicine can sometimes reduce a patient by pushing normalcy onto them, but similar to how it also instills negative emotions and has biological consequences. Even though harm is not intended, it really does impact a patient emotionally and potentially even affects their healing process, as we just saw right now, as it upregulates inflammatory markers. And furthermore, explaining the brief point I mentioned previously, these negative emotions affect the HPA axis, in turn causing a full body response, so it's not just psychological distress. This article explains that HPA axis is the body's central stress response system, and it matters because cortisol receptors are found in almost every organ. This means that when the HPA axis is dysregulated, stress doesn't just affect mood, it affects the brain, immune system, metabolism, and cardiovascular system, and your overall energy levels. So chronic psychological stress can disrupt normal cortisol rhythms, either keeping cortisol too high for too long, messing up the stress response entirely, and this makes it harder for the body to return to a balanced or to a homeostatic state. So you have more fatigue, insomnia, anxiety, depression. So the article emphasizes that this creates many cycles of stress, increasing inflammation, and as that worsens, it also affects your whole body. And then another point that literature helped emphasize was the negative effects caused by medicine. And yes, we're turning back to the medical model and how medicine is not always the right way to treat a patient. A really good example of this was David Small, who went through his experience and talked about how as a child growing up with his father, who was a radiologist, and claimed that he knew what was right for him. We always hear this where the doctor's always right. However, here we are seeing a case where medicine causes more harm than good. He suffered both medical and psychological abuse, emphasizing the effect that the medical gaze and words have on a person. In this case, he was silenced and objectified, not treated as a person, but rather a case, eliminating his identity as both a son and a patient. Medicine is not the only mode for treatment, and we might have to take a step back. I know this sounds weird, as many of us may intend to go into medicine or are medical professionals, but another part of treatment that we should start incorporating is emphasizing that impact that words may have, suggesting that healthcare teams should not instill superiority, be cautious, and of course, as mentioned before, be careful with words. So I just want to re-emphasize this. We have to start being careful with our words, as they do have a large impact. And then, so what should we do as medical professionals or health students? A good way to start is just asking the patient how they feel about certain words. For example, some people might love metaphors. It just has to be discussed with them beforehand. And a great example is Andrea Gibson, where in her in the article she wrote about battling cancer, and then instead of battling cancer, she said that she will allow this, meaning that she had already accepted her condition and was okay with these words being used. And then it's also best to use neutral languages language or words such as that allow the patient to feel how they feel, not forcing any ideas such as wearing prosthetics as we had seen, and also just respecting the patient in general. And this is important because we have seen that empathy actually improves or causes higher oxytocin. So, empathy provides comfort to patients and reduces stress. It stimulates oxytocin, which is what many know as like the happy hormone. And the tone really shapes the empathetic response. So, amount of oxytocin that is being released actually depends on threat levels or also social cues. So, how one speaks to a patient actually does matter, and language does matter. Every little word matters, and that's the main point. And it's not just, as mentioned, psychologically, it's also through immunity. They had actually done an interesting study by Yang where they compared different nurses who ranked different levels on like how empathetic they were, and then cancer patients who had high empathy nurses actually once they left the hospital, they had significantly higher B cells and NK cells. And this is pretty good for cancer patients as it meant that their immune system was more stimulated and had a stronger immune response against their condition. And they found a significantly strong correlation between empathy and immune system responses. And they had hypothesized or concluded that empathy will essentially decrease stress, and it ties back to the HPA axis, as in this case empathy and kind words actually lowered the HPA axis activation, in turn reducing immunosuppression and increasing the immune cell activation. And this is a great little summary of how this may help a patient. It helps with improving patient compliance as they have more trust in the physician, increasing patient satisfaction, and overall having a better communication between physician and patients, and then understanding what their condition means and getting the proper care for it, not just through medicine but also through words and language. So in conclusion, we just saw that language is really important, and literature was able to expose a lot of the thoughts in medicine by exposing how the medical model is majorly used in hospitals or by people who intend to go into a medical field, and oftentimes because of this it causes physicians to use more charged language or not care as much about the words that they say, or also leads to feelings of neglect. However, we saw that this negative language actually does matter. So how you speak to a patient could induce negative biological and physiological effects, not just psychological. And overall, by changing or incorporating language into this idea of cure, we could provide better patient care. And that's it for my presentation. Thank you for listening. And these are the resources I used.